Hello, very good to join you.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you back. As soon as I saw that your book was announced, I emailed you, or that it was coming out. I emailed you to book the show. It took us a little while to get it going, but here we are, very hyped to discuss this topic with you, to discuss this awesome book. The book is Awake. It presents William Blake not just as a poet or an artist, but really as a guide for our times, right here, right now. What do you believe is the most urgent message Blake has for us today? Living in this world of dark satanic mills, a phrase that often goes through my head in the middle of the workday. You describe Blake as a quote unquote seer who is driven by visionary studies. For a modern audience that might be skeptical about such experiences, how do you explain the nature of Blake's visions and how can we begin to understand them as a valid way of knowing?
Well, I think the imagination is key, hence stressing the power of the imagination in the book. And in a way, the fundamental invitation from Blake is to think of the imagination not as something that you might possess, I might possess, an artist or creative might possess in some kind of greater measure, but as something that flows through the whole of the natural world, the whole of life, and that we can become aligned with it. A tree is aligned with this divine flow of imagination in the way that it shows up. But we have this extra capacity to do so consciously and to therefore become collaborators, co creators with the imagination. And so that flip from thinking that imagination is what you might call a sort of private fantasy that, maybe adds color to life, but probably most of the time shouldn't be trusted, to seeing the imagination as that which we're already always thoroughly immersed in, but we can become much more discerning about, aligned with, and then life starts to open up. I mean, it's kind of what happens anyway. There's no real surprise here, that the scientist employs this kind of imagination and trusts that what they bring with their intuitions, their sense of what's good, beautiful, and true, and so on, then making tractable for equations and experiments and all that, of course, as well. But nonetheless, the imagination is the spring point for any kind of science. Einstein was a really big advocate of this. He said the imagination's been given to us precisely to enable us to see more and more of the world. But for some reason, you know, the, we tended to become skeptical about the imagination in our wider culture, as if it is this thing that somehow is generated in the brain and then projected out onto an otherwise dead and inert cosmos. I became persuaded that this couldn't possibly be the case because I worked for quite a few years in a psychiatric hospital and I work as a psychotherapist as well as writing. And it became very clear to me there that there are people who are trapped in a very narrow and tight imaginative world that's just on repeat. And that is an imagination that's closed in on the individual. And it's tragic. It generates huge amounts of suffering. But of course, imagination also opens up in the work of science, in the work of artists, actually in the work of us all when we enjoy life day by day. And so that sense that if the imagination were, as is sort of officially described, a kind of private fantasy, if that was so, we would all be actually kind of crazy and definitely suffering, not be able to move through life. So this persuaded me that actually no, it must be as Blake and of course others before Blake have said, that it's this great flow of creativity, of illumination. It can be, of course, darkness, it can be fearsome as well as awesome. But nonetheless, this is the fundamental move for Blake. And then once you take that on trust, the journey kind of begins. And, part of what I try and do in the book is show how where that journey can lead. I give you the end of a golden string, Blake says, only wind it into a ball. And so winding it into a ball is the kind of journey I try and take people on.
Yeah. Well, talking about that journey, the book's structured around the three phases of Blake's development: foundations, energy, and divinity. Can you walk us through this schema and kind of explain how his understanding of the imagination evolved?
Yeah. Blake's he's a hard person to write about for a number of reasons. One is because he forms you in the engagement with him. That's why people at first can find Blake quite a struggle,
Yeah.
because the invitation is not just to stay the same and take down, as it were, what is being written on the page. It is actually to be challenged by what's written on the page, and as you are changed by that, so it opens up. I mean, the Divine Comedy by Dante is exactly the same. Really inspired texts, as a rule, I think, are like this, actually. That's, I think, one of the reasons why we feel that they're inspired. But it means that there's a challenge, there's a mental fight, as Blake puts it. So what I tried to do in the book was show how there's a kind of foundational moment, which partly is a kind of openness. It is also I'm going to accept on trust that the imagination is perhaps much more than I thought. I'm going to bring in a sharp discernment as well, a kind of bunch of virtues that then lead you to enter the energy, the energetics of the imagination, the second part. And that's also about how you live your life, as well as how you engage with poetry and look at imagery and so on. But the idea broadly is that enables you to enter this kind of flow, this energy. Energy is the only life, Blake said. And by energy, he kind of means also imagination, and he also actually means spirit. I think they're almost synonyms in Blake. Energy is not just this inert stuff that will do work like modern physics describes energy. It has a direction of travel. It has a telos. It takes you somewhere. It's much more like the flow of a river into an ocean. And so energy is the second step. But then the third step is to keep following Blake with this golden string and see how much it becomes possible to discern the divine imagination, this source, this wellspring of the energy that you've gained some sort of relationship with through the foundational virtues. And I wanted to push that too, because another thing that tends to happen, as well as reducing the imagination when people read Blake, is they tend to minimize how actually he is saying all our finite perceptions are really perceptions of the infinite. All our temporal perceptions are really glimpses of eternity. And so taking that divinity, that full vision really seriously, because he felt that one of the things that was going so wrong in the modern world was a kind of denial of that. And that's bad, because we human beings have this sort of divine expanse at our core. And so if it's denied in some way, you're actually denying our humanity. And much of the spirals that Blake foresaw, and I think we see in the modern world, are really at root about that.
Yeah. Well, talking about Blake and modernity, I get a lot out of reading, mystics and esotericists from the 18th and 19th century, because they are making this critique and this connection to what they see going around them, the seeds of the world that we live in now. But you argue that Blake didn't reject the massive changes of his era, but he actually saw them as true hope through one that has become deeply, dangerously confused. So how does Blake teach us to engage with the overwhelming energies of our own time? Political turmoil, technological advancements, social change, without being consumed by them. Because maybe you disagree, but I feel like people are currently being consumed by them.
I mean, it's definitely a risk. There's no change without risk. And the whole point is that a part of you becomes vulnerable and exposed. And, that can happen at a social level as well as an individual level. But at the end of the day, Blake felt that the relationship between these contraries, as he puts it, between love and hate, good and evil, they're tipped in favor of what's good, in favor of the loving, in favor of the light. He's quite, actually quite orthodox Christian, in that he felt that darkness really is an absence of light. Hatred is actually a twisted form of love. The bad is actually a mistaken desire for something that's taken to be good, but actually isn't. And so, in some ways, although the journey down can be quite a steep descent, it's going to bottom out at some point because of this structure of reality, Blake felt. But there's also a meaning to the descent. It's not just a kind of unfortunate detour, because I think that the descent, or the possibility for descent, arises from the freedom that we have, the liberty which we have. which Blake felt is at root a kind of freedom of perception, a freedom to collaborate with the imagination. Again, that's part of what distinguishes we human beings, is that we can lean one way or the other kind of consciously. Other creatures no doubt react to the world as well, but they do it more instinctively. And there's something about this modern freedom that we have that Blake was really onto. And, he himself sort of used his freedom in his creative endeavors. And he very much wanted this to be well known. He did actually desire to be a commercial success. He in that way he was modern too. He strove to produce work that was at the right price that could capture the imagination of people. It has done subsequently, but this is all to say that he's not the kind of romantic figure that withdraws from the world and feels that modernity is just all going one way and going wrong. He's very much not like that. He feels that the divine impulse can actually always be trusted, and there's meaning even in darkness. Another way of putting this is that he actually was no mean scientist himself, although he's often presented as being anti-science. And the reason why I say that is because in his work, he was a huge experimenter with materials. And, if you'd gone into his workshop with Catherine as well, his wife, you would have smelt the kind of acid burning into metal on the air, and you would have seen microscopes and screens and different kinds of paper and washes, and it would have looked like a kind of alchemist lab, I think. And so he knew about material things, knew them, I think, as kind of characters with real qualities and personalities, as much as different kinds of elements and so on. But he's thoroughly again immersed, I think, in the material nature of things, because, as he says, you see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. It's by going into things, by the descents, that you discover them more.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the concept of the contraries? Talk about dialectical Blake, this reason and energy, love and hate, and how it's so central to his work. How we're embracing these tensions, right? We're not trying to resolve them. And then this is what leads to the eternal delight he wrote of.
Yeah, he felt that mortal life, anyway, transient life, is one which is stretched out by contraries. We know these contraries within us, and we see them operative in the world around us. And the word contrary is not contradiction. It's just like I think actually he was probably inspired by the work that was being done on electromagnetism. He's nearly contemporary with Faraday, for example, and electromagnetism and magnets, you'll know, have a north and a south pole. And if you decided that you were going to get rid of all the south poles, and so kind of cut the magnets in half, of course, you wouldn't get rid of all the south poles. All you'd do is double the number of magnets you had. And so, like the north and south pole of a magnet, the contraries always go together, but they also mark the field that exists between the poles, the magnetic field. That's where the energy lies. And so I think that Blake's call really is to recognize the contraries in life, but not to despair, not to feel you've got to judge what's right and what's wrong, and so split and divide the human experience. Again, something which we see so much of now. Again, both at the individual but also at the collective level. But to embrace the contraries, because then you'll find that the energy of life exists, and from within that field, new things can emerge, new possibilities, fresh insights. That's really where the imagination gets going. It is about judging things, but it's judging so as to liberate more rather than to condemn. And so, that message to me feels very relevant to now. Not trying to live through life deciding whether you're for or against this, whether that's right or wrong, even whether you're of the left or the right. Blake, actually, the notion that politics is divided into the left and the right emerged in Blake's lifetime after the French Revolution. And he saw that as a mistake. Truth can be found everywhere, actually. The light is there even in the greatest darkness. And we human beings have the possibility, partly for our freedom, to embrace that truth. And it can be a mental fight. It can be very hard, but is absolutely part of our divine calling.
Yeah. Can you tell us about Blake's mystical influences like Jakob Burma, Teresa of Avila, Swedenborg, and then later the Eastern thought and his contact with Eastern mystical thought and how this all evolved?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful range there of influences on Blake. He was a porous person in all sorts of ways. He could see the angels, as it were, but he was also very alert to the spirit that was in his own tradition and other traditions. So, I mean, you mentioned like three particular figures there. Jakob Burma, he references Burma in his work, and I think that Burma was very influential on all sorts of mystical figures in the early modern period. Um, and I think Blake particularly would have warmed to Burma because he seemed to have cleansed the doors of perception, in this famous glimpse of light in a bowl of water that Burma had, that then led him on this extraordinary journey, and writing. So I think that Blake would have felt a kindred spirit there. Swedenborg, similarly, he found a kindred spirit. Swedenborg was this very established, actually, engineer in Georgian London, and then had these visions in his midlife, in his 50s, where he traveled to heavens and hells and then wrote about that. And I think that Blake, again, would have found someone who was clearly a very smart person, a scientist to boot, but had these experiences of other worlds that Blake felt he did as well. So he was inspired by Swedenborg. He was also incidentally inspired by Swedenborg because Swedenborg, in one of his prophetic writings, had written that in the year 1757, a new age would be born. And of course, Blake was born in 1757 and wasn't, slow at picking up on that allusion, and in a slightly witty way, but sort of semi-serious way too, in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he sort of says, well, guess what? I was born in 1757. But he fell out with the Swedenborgians when they established the church. Blake always was wary of the institutionalization of these things. He felt that they too quickly descend into a set of rules. And the story is that he went to a Swedenborgian church, saw kind of writ over the door, "Thou shalt not," and never darken that door again. And then Teresa of Avila, I think he was particularly fond of, actually. There's letters that say he would quote Teresa of Avila. And she's particularly interesting because she's a Catholic and she's now a doctor of the Catholic Church, a very, very significant figure. But Blake could recognize in even Catholicism, which in Georgian England was viewed with great suspicion. There had been the Act of Toleration, but Catholics still suffered. There was the Gordon riots earlier in Blake's life, which was this anti-Catholic riot that spread through London over many, many days, and it ended up with hundreds of people being killed as a result. So it was quite taboo, really, to start quoting figures like Teresa of Avila. But he did, and again, I think that she, perhaps more than the others, her experience of living with figures like angels, conversing with the divine, in Teresa of Avila's case, even experiencing things like levitation and so on. I think Blake, again, felt that here was a hugely intelligent, smart person that knew of these other things. And so found, solace, but also a kind of interlocutor and encouragement himself to try and write about them, because Teresa of Avila was also, an extraordinary writer. And then you get the other influences. I think they particularly come from through the British Empire. Remember, he lives in the time when the empire is still growing, actually, but it's in a very full extent. London is the center of that empire. Mercantilism is booming. There's all the downsides of empire, of course, as well. But the upside, certainly for Blake, was that it meant that he had access to texts like the Bhagavad Gita when they were translated. There's less direct evidence for this, but I think he would have had access to the Quran as well, because it too was translated in his lifetime. And I think that his engagements with those two traditions particularly kind of stirred the mysticism within Christianity that was otherwise rather inclined to be sidelined in his times. The Church of England religiosity certainly was very sort of civic, very establishment. And Blake therefore needed these kind of interlocutors to plumb the depths of what was also inherent in Christianity. And he knew the translator of the Bhagavad Gita, and he did drawings of Brahmins. And I think quite a lot of his work, particularly actually, is influenced by the Gita. So a good example is Blake has this character called Vala, and Vala is a figure who would veil you and so obscure and confuse you about the nature of reality. And I think Vala is a pun on Maya and veiling. Maya, which is this, sometimes personified, but certainly this tendency to be confused about the nature of reality. And so Blake's character Vala is Maya with her veil. But then also, I mean, I think he also would have had, well, he mentions figures like indigenous Americans as well. Again, in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And I think that was because from the Americas, from the colonies, and then after the War of Independence from America, we're learning more about this actually now, but there was quite a steady flow of figures across the Atlantic, indigenous Americans too. And, London was a growing city, but still small enough for Blake to pretty easily have met figures like that. And so hence his reference to indigenous Americans, who he says were onto the same thing as all the other traditions, actually, which is, rather wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, I had no idea. Well, when talking about Burma, you mentioned this phrase, this concept, this line that Blake has, the idea of cleansing the doors of perception. Can you explain that to us and give us some of the practical ways you think we can apply this in our daily lives to see the world as infinite, as Blake suggested?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that phrase, because it was adopted by Aldous Huxley in the title of his book, The Doors of Perception, and then, of course, there's the band, The Doors, as well. It's taken to mean a kind of peak experience or a trip or a kind of glimpse of the infinite. And, that certainly happens. But Blake, I think, meant it more profoundly, which was to attack the philosophy that would say our perceptual apparatus are doors onto reality. So empiricism, British empiricism, which was fully growing at the time, John Locke was in the previous generation to Blake, set the ball going with British empiricism. And this sort of says that we receive sense data from the outer world, but then that lands on the tabula rasa of our mind. And then a little private imagination might sort of move these bits and pieces around to create some sort of almost coherent model of reality. But the senses don't enable us to make contact with reality. This is the point. The senses let something in, but in the same moment cut us off as well. And so that's the doors of perception. The phrase is kind of intriguing. Blake doesn't say the windows of perception, which is what you might expect if he was just talking about kind of looking through something. Though he's actually criticizing the philosophy of mind that says we're cut off, and so perception has become as many sets of doors. And so he's saying to us, lean into the imagination. It needs discerning, but it is trustworthy ultimately. And the analogy that he uses, which I find quite helpful, is he says, look, treat your senses, so sight and hearing and taste and touch and, all the other felt ways that we engage with life, as thresholds, as portals. And he said, it's like a window. When you see a window, you don't look at the glass, you look through it, and then you see the expanse of the world outside. And he says that our senses can become exactly that. And the famous example that he gives is about the sun, where one person might see the sun and think, oh, it's a round ball of light looking golden about the size of a guinea, and think they've captured all there is to see. Whereas Blake says, no, 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 I see the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy. And I think that's about leaning into the fullness of the experience, not just asking, what color is it, but what does that color do to me? What effect does it have on me? And when I get in a sunrise or sunset, a great sort of streak of light coming towards me, it feels like I've been reached out to and touched. We'll go with that and see where it leads you. And then, you notice in the autumn of the year, and the light starts to subdue, and it has an effect on your emotion, and then the spring comes and the light returns, and that has an effect on your emotions. Well, that's not some kind of private experience. That is participating in the moods, the consciousness, the inner life of all things. So it's about gaining a kind of habit of leaning into what your experience is already telling you, but not closing it off. And then you read poets, and you look at imagery, and you discern all the time. The reason really matters, because otherwise it just becomes a sort of private explosion of ill-defined impulses, if you like. No, you've got to wind the ball, but you've got to follow the golden string as well. So bringing in reason, but reason now is in the service of the imagination. It's not, as it were, condemning the imagination. So that's part of the flip too.
Right. So you touch upon Blake's views on money, sex, power. What were his critiques of these forces and how they operate in society? And what did he propose as a more liberated way of understanding them?
Well, again, money, sex, and power, they are direct ways that we experience living in contraries. So let me take sex. He's sometimes said to be in favor of free love, but one of his poems called Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which tracks the encounter that the heroine of the poem has with sex as she kind of awakens sexually. And libertarianism, free love, is not part of the story at all. I mean, actually, she is brutalized by her first sexual encounters, but she kind of keeps faith with the erotic in her. And what that does is lead her to the revelation that everything that lives is holy. Everything that lives is holy. This is quite a regular phrase in Blake. And what that is about is that she realizes that her own sort of erotic stirrings, they'll lead her to delight, but also to, well, even trauma, and they'll lead her to communication with others, but also alienation, and even despair at times. But by keeping faith with the erotic, she realizes that a similar pulse of desire, of yearning, of reaching, of longing, all shaped by what's beautiful. She starts to see that this exists in all the things around her, other creatures, other plants, even the skies. Everything seems to have this kind of tendency towards a direction of travel. It's not just random. The plant reaches for the light because it's reaching for life too. And the animal seeks comfort and security, but also connection. It's not purely physical, it's emotional as well. Our language too, we're reaching not just to communicate instrumentally, as if I need a cup of tea, so I ask you for a cup of tea. We're reaching to try and say more. We're reaching always into this imaginative space. And so the erotic is a key part of how we can learn more and more about the way that all things are reaching, are yearning, are tending in a certain kind of direction. And again, it's complicated, it's confused, things go wrong. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, Blake says everything can be known as holy, by which he means that the direction of travel is ultimately towards the divine, with the divine calling all things towards itself as well.
Yeah. So you write that for Blake, that the human psyche is quote unquote a sharing of the inside of the whole world. Could you unpack what he meant and how this changes our understanding of ourselves and our place in the cosmos?
Yeah, I mean, I love that phrase. I mean, it actually comes from another big inspiration, Owen Barfield. And Barfield said that consciousness is not something bolted onto the rest of the world, which is sort of how we inclined to, well, it's certainly how we're told to think about our own consciousness. The rest of the world is kind of dead, and we just, for some reason, have this spark of light inside our heads. Barfield said, no, it's the inside of the whole world. So we've arisen from the world, biologically, of course, but also psychically too. But, much like evolution leads to increasing complexity in organisms, so as well the consciousness which we arise with, adds something back to the consciousness from which it came, which is our particular kind of self-reflexivity, our use of language, our capacity to have freedom. And so that way of understanding things, I think, really matters because, I mean, I work as a psychotherapist, and I feel that one of the things that happens is that people, broadly speaking, are informed in psychology about how to manage their private lives, and by that I mean their kind of inner psychic life, better when things have gone wrong. And that is helpful. You know, it might be a behavioral technique, it might be by some kind of deeper insight about what's happened to you. But that it sort of stops there. And I feel that part of what's happening with the mental health crisis is that what's being implicitly denied there is the next step, which is to realize that we're participating in a wider consciousness. And that what can happen is when you become at ease enough with your own mind, is you can realize that that is in relationship to, well, first of all, other minds, but then also a mind that is kind of shared by all minds, a kind of field, if you like, of mentality, and that our intelligence fits a divine intelligence, which is, you know, why we can do science and so on, for one thing. But that expansion of our private consciousness into realizing it's part and parcel of the inside of the whole world, not just our own inside, I think is a really key step. I mean, Blake summarizes it in a number of different ways. One of the lovely quatrains I like, where when he writes, you know, he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And in many different ways, we're told these days about how to bind to ourselves the joy, whatever we want, but not to kiss the joy as it flies. And so, in a way, give all we have back to that which is given us. That's kissing the joy as it flies. So I feel this is a really crucial move on Blake's part. That, you know, at once, I don't know, for me, it feels at once quite intuitively right somehow. And it's almost how we live anyway. You know, if you really did live as if you were a private consciousness that was disconnected and isolated in an otherwise sort of vacuum or a void, you really would become nihilistic, and that is untenable. Luckily for us, most people don't live like that. But on the other hand, the official scientific story is that that wider consciousness doesn't exist. It is just a product of the grey matter inside our heads. You know, so we live in a very conflicted time, really. You can't really live like science tells you the way things are, for all the benefits that science brings.
Yeah. So finally, the title of your book is Awake. What is the primary thing you hope readers will wake up to after reading your exploration of William Blake's life and work?
I think it's a kind of spiritual analysis of ourselves and our times. You know, I think the reason why Blake can speak to us now, and not just speaking to the world 200 years ago, is that 200 years ago, many of the assumptions that we now take for granted were being born. Words like nihilism actually were coined in Georgian England, and the scientific approach to things was really bedding down. You know, these figures like John Locke and others were shaping our understanding of the mind. And Blake saw the kind of inner story of that, and both could accept, you know, what was good about it, but also critique it. Remember the contraries, you know, it applies to everything. And I think that now that so many of these assumptions have become so embedded, we're almost not aware that they exist. We can do with going back to a figure like Blake, who saw the beginnings of this unfolding, and his analysis, which is partly a critique, you know, single vision of Newton's sleep, the dark satanic mills, as you mentioned there. You know, this is a critique, but it's also an antidote, because Blake also talks about kissing the joy as it flies. He also talks about the mental fight. He also talks about seeing the world in a grain of sand. And so the very energy of the poetry draws you. And that's one of the wonderful things about poetry, of course, is it has an energy. And so Blake is at once an analysis, but he's also a catharsis and then a transformation. And so awake is one of his favorite words. His injunction is to awake, O sleeper in the land of shadows, awake. I am in you and you're in me, mutual in love divine, he says. So that sense of expanded life, I quote Blake a lot in the book, woven into my own text, because I hope that energy, comes through, and then of course leads people back to Blake's work as well. It's that expansion, in a nutshell, that I hope people get from reading the book.
Amazing. So again, the name of the book is Awake,
William Blake and the Power of the Imagination.
You can buy it wherever books are sold, and we will have a link in the show notes. MarkVernon.com to keep up with everything that Mark is doing, and we will also have that in the show notes. Mark, thanks so much for writing this book, and thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about it.
Thanks for having me again, John. It's very nice to speak about these things. In the speaking, I hope people can feel the energy.
I think they can. I felt it. So it's I think it's an important book. I think it's a relevant book. I really want to get across that relevancy, right? That it's not just an academic book about things that Blake thought about 200 years ago. It's something that you could use for your life right here, right now.
Hooray, I'm glad. Yeah.
Thanks again, Mark. Take care.
Cheers for now.